So you may know that this Tuesday is Shrove Tuesday. You might have noticed all the Mardi Gras festivities or got to participate in them this weekend. And Mardi Gras and Fat Tuesday are the same word, just a different language. And we're entering then into the season of Lent. A lot of Christians don't really practice Lent, but it is definitely a part of our tradition to do so. And that is a time in which we approach the remembrance of the death of Jesus by taking on for ourselves some spiritual discipline or some activity that reminds us of Jesus' death, and we give something up, or we take on an activity that helps us be mindful of that through that season. The 40 days of Lent are bookended. This is the first bookend, the Transfiguration, and the last of the bookend is the resurrection. So we move into this season that is fairly somber and really reminds us. We start with remembering our death, and then we end with remembering Jesus' death. It's very interesting to think about the bookend because we have here a moment where Jesus, who has been with his disciples walking this earth for 33 years or so, changes up. He is transfigured, which in Greek means he's metamorphosized. He morphs from being simply a human being that the disciples know and recognize into his inner life, his divine revelation, the reality that he is both God and human is revealed in the Transfiguration. And then at the resurrection, it's kind of flipped, right? He comes back and his divinity makes sense because he died, but he's still a human. So they both ways show us the sense of the divine nature of God. One thing you might not know, and I thought this was really interesting, is that in the 500s, when the church had this big split and some became Roman Catholic and some became Eastern Orthodox, if we're going to use simple terms, the Roman Catholic tradition really emphasized the crucifixion. And when their saints were really, really holy, they got the stigmata. They got the wounds of Christ on their body. But in the Eastern Orthodox Church, they really looked at the resurrection and the epiphany, this transfiguration of Jesus. And so when they knew somebody was really holy, they transfigured. They shone with a holy light. And that was how they, and still is, how they identify their saints. Well, I think it's important for us then to maybe spend some time thinking about transfiguration and us. We humans. I mean, I've tended to think of this story as uniquely Jesus. But when you come to think about it, we see people morphing all the time. We see transfigurations. We see change in ourselves and others. So what can we learn from this story to help us make sense of our own transfigurations, our own changes, and make sure that they're in alignment with our discipleship to Jesus Christ? This inward light of grace that we see in Jesus was named by Irenaeus, this theologian of the 2nd century, and he said, what's happening here is a thing for us to claim, because what we're seeing is a human being fully alive. And a human being fully alive is a vision of God. That's what the Transfiguration is about. Jesus, fully alive, unbroken by sin, undamaged by context, instead living the fullness of his identity in God and showing a vision of God, showing us the divine nature. And so for us, the invitation is also to be a human being fully alive. So 2 Peter clearly talks about this. Now, you know there are 3 guys who go up there, right? James, John, and Peter. They go up on the mountain. But the only place we really hear from an eyewitness is right here in that text you heard from 2 Peter. And 2 Peter says, we have received the prophetic message more fully confirmed because of this revelation of Jesus. And because of it, we are like a lamp in a dark place. Okay, so we're going to be lamps. We're going to glow with an inner light. How do we know we're on that way? How do we keep being called to transfigure and support it with others? Well, Jesus did it like that, right? This was a moment of revelation. But for most of us, we're more on the tree side of things. Trees transform all the time, but they're really slow at it. You know, you're not going to sit and watch a tree grow. And we're much more like that most of the time as well. Our transitions are over a slowness of time, most of the time. But sometimes they're really sudden. So I want to give you an example of a slow. Niecy Nash, who's a comedian, she had an older brother, and when she was a teenager, he was shot and killed. And when that happened, the light of their lives went out, and her mom said, "I'm going to bed, and I'm never getting up." And she meant it. She went to bed, and she did not get up. And Niecy is suddenly dealing with a mom that's not functioning and trying to be a teenager and figure it out. So what did she do? She went to school, and when she came home, she would go to the foot of her mother's bed and do stand-up comedy. She would do anything she could to make her mom laugh. And she wasn't very good at it, so her mom wasn't getting up. It wasn't like doing a lot, but she started to get better and better, and she started to work her new trade of making her mom laugh. And months later, she came home one day, and Mom was in the living room with a neighbor and a friend and said, "Hey, Niecy, come in here. I want you to show them how funny you are." So she walked into the living room, and she said, it won't be funny if I say it. She said, "Thank you so much for coming out tonight to the living room." And then she started in on her comedy. That process changed that person. Niecy now is a movie person and a TV person and has a life that came out of the slow transfiguration from this very challenging time in her life. Another example is a quick one, a quick transfiguration. My son had mono, and we went to the emergency room, and the doctor came in after a blood test and said, "You have leukemia." And suddenly, everything changed. Kaboom. Everything. And what I witnessed in that moment was the inner life of this young man that I had watched grow up, who to me was more about leaving his dishes where I wished he'd pick them up, and more about what's he going to do here and what's he going to do there. He suddenly became a person with a value in other people, with concern for the people who are walking in the room to take care of him. I remember walking behind the gurney with him as he was going for tests, and there was a young man who was pushing him, and they were just talking away, and Wes was asking him questions, and I suddenly saw a reality, an inner person in this kid that I've known all my life that I had never seen before. I bet you have a story like that. Hopefully it's a good one, but we've also seen transfigurations that are terrifying in people. And that's the question. How do we be people that when the hard time comes or when the long growth comes, that we are more and more shaped in the nature and person of fully alive? Fully alive. Well, we got James, John, and Peter, and they weren't doing so good at the transfiguration. They were just like we would be. They're terrified. They're crouched down. They're scared to death. They're not role models at that moment, right? But we know that years down the road, they will be glowing with an inner light, that they got there. So what did we hear in that text that guided them? There were 3 things that were said by the divine. 3 things. 2 from Jesus, 1 from the cloud. The cloud. Jesus and God in the cloud. It was downloaded. So what's interesting is in Matthew, the one we heard, there are 3 spoken words. In the other 2 synoptics, it's just 1. It's 1. Listen. This is my beloved son. Listen to him. But here, Jesus gives some instruction as well. So let's just think about what it said. This is my son, the beloved. Listen to him. Listen. Listening's not easy. Listening's really hard in a world where there are so many distractions, so much that we want to do and get done. Listen. Just the act of listening is a discipline and an intention. What do we hear when we listen? It's not simply letting the word go in one ear and kind of that way. It's about letting it go in and go down into our heart, letting ourselves be fully present to what is being brought to us in a day. And then listen to him, to Jesus. How do we listen to the divine as we understand the divine as Christians? How do we let that word get in and down and become life for us? Well, these guys were like scared to death. They can't even see Jesus because the light is so bright, and they're just freaked out. What happened? They don't know. Peter's trying to figure out. He's like us. Let's just build some houses and figure it out. Moses and Elijah, holy cow. What is happening? They're terrified. Listening is probably really hard right then. But Jesus comes up and touches them and says, get up. Get up. Don't be afraid. Those are the next two instructions. Get up, don't be afraid. You're overwhelmed. Some huge transfigurating event just happened to you. Get up, don't be afraid. The only way to not be afraid is to trust, right? You're going to feel it anyway. But how do we get up and trust? When we're faced with transfiguration in ourselves, when we're changed with a morphing world, it's so easy to crouch down and hide. Crouching down and hiding might be just watch TV and don't think about it. It might be go plan that trip and don't think about it. Whatever it is, the part that's risky is the don't think about it. It's the not getting up. It's the not facing it and trusting that God's going to walk with us through it. So those are the instructions for us as we look toward our own transfiguration. And you know, there's a bookend, right? We're transfiguring in this life. We're going to, who we are, our metal, as they used to call it, our inner character, is going to be tested in this world. If it hasn't been already 50 times, it's on the way. And that is our opportunity to shine with the light of Christ. But the great hope is there's another bookend. It's the resurrection. And when we end this life, no matter how crappy we might think it had been, maybe the last moment of our life was our best moment, which is tragic. Maybe we never had one. But there is hope because we are wrapped in the grace and light of God. So we don't have to worry like that we're not transfiguring. We want to just lean in. Why? Because it's life. It's us being fully alive. What's better than that? So I told you about that Nisi and this comedian thing that happened to her. You know there was somebody else that was transfigured in that, right? The mom got out of bed. The mom laughed. The mom was touched, and she stood up and did not fear. That's what our gift is for each other, that we do that we remind each other that we, fully alive, are a vision of God for others. What a privilege. Is there anything better in the world than that? I haven't found it. May we do it. May we lean in and do it and let our lives be a mountain and a beacon and a light in a world that longs to see what it